One of the things that came up yesterday that struck me in particular was the slightly mournful articulation of the absence of philosophy, a kind of nostalgia for 15 years ago when philosophy was architecture's subject. And this, I would sort of recast this a little bit and say that for the past 15 years, there has been an absence of philosophy, not of philosophizing, but of philosophy as a sign and as a kind of legitimator and generator of architectural form. That view of philosophy historically, I think, at least in the United States, is associated above all with Peter Eisenman. And it's, in very simple terms, one can recall that Eisenman started a lecture-giving protocol in which every lecture began with a set of ideas and theoretical premises, and then at the end moved to a demonstration of work produced. We saw that a little bit in Patrick, although we never got to the work that was produced yesterday. I hope we get back to that. And I would say that that staging is really embedded in a certain notion of the concept and of a certain notion of form. The concept, in a very Aristotelian sense, is presented as the generator and legitimator of form, which is then its embodiment. So the staging, this separation of the initial philosophical gambit with the form coming afterwards, is itself not just using philosophy as a subject, but is the production of a certain notion of concept. So I would say that philosophy hasn't been absent for the last 15 years. It's just that particular staging and view of philosophy that has been absent for the last 15 years. And an alternative view may be one that we could describe as concepts arising from form and from our experience of form has been the one that has at least interested me the most. In that context, the job of philosophy would not be to legitimize or to generate form, but rather to orchestrate and to help understand how experience becomes intellection by passing through apperception and affect. This process, which for the students of the 18th century might associate with Condillac and the history of sensationalist philosophy, we might now today call environmental. Now, discourses on medium specificity seem very alien or oblique to this problem of the logic of environmentalism in thinking. But it interests me. I think it's a useful model for thinking about this because medium specificity, as it began as a discourse in the 1930s, was very devoted to ideas of autonomy, and then moved through notions of opposition and so forth. All of these things can be tracked to the development of certain notions of concept. And in the last few years, medium specificity, the discourses around it, have moved more into the problem of relation of one medium, it's not a good term anymore, but of one, let's call it format, to another. And in this relational move, you could say that the problem of the medium has become ecological. Now, I would also say that rather than try to set up the relation between media, again, as they once were in the notion of an organic unity, I would say instead that what's the most interesting is the point of contact between mediums or formats, these points of contact between slightly different forms of instantiation, and that point of contact produces the affect of tenderness, which I don't know how to translate it in Croatian or any appropriate language, but the term tender has a very complex double sense. It's produced both by the hitting of flesh, for example, that becomes tender. If you go to a bad steakhouse and they serve you a really terrible cut of meat, you are given a tenderizer to make it possible to digest and to eat. And on the other hand, tenderness is also a form of gentleness. We might recall the whole tradition of the gentle manifesto and so forth. So I would describe tenderness as a way to produce the sensation of both the pain and intimacy of contact. Now, contact between what was once called mediums is one of the few things that unites many otherwise highly different architectural practices of the day. Gary is often called sculptural, whether he's actually making sculpture or using sculpture to blow it up to the level of the building. One might even say this identification between art and architecture is a kind of international style, if you will, of contemporary practice. We know it well from the history of Zaha's work in relation to Russian constructivist painting, all the way through to the kind of graphic quality of recent projects like the Maxi. It's not vocabulary that we often use, but certainly I think that Herzog and de Meuron and a whole series of practices can very, very easily be assimilated into the discourses on the surfaces of minimalist sculpture. So these practices are all very different in many, many respects, except for this identification with the visual arts. Rem is somebody who I think likes to think of himself as having escaped this paradigm, but in fact, I'm not sure who works harder, David Hockney or Rem, to be the kind of heir, if you will, to Andy Warhol and everything that Andy Warhol stood for. This crossing of boundaries between mediums was famously expounded in Rosalind Krauss's essay, The Architecture, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And to continue this development into the work of slightly younger architects, I think that you could say in the practices of somebody like Diller and Scofidio, who came into architectural being, if you will, in the wake of Krauss's essay, rather than trying to work out the expanded field. The expanded field, in fact, became their site. Our architecture itself came to occupy the expanded field, to be the expanded field, in an almost perverse unfolding of Hans Hollein's famous comment, architecture is everything. In the context of the expanded field, just about anything could become architecture, and it was at this moment that architecture came through the notion of installation and so forth to become isomorphic, if you will, with a certain notion of the environment. And when architecture became environmental, if you will, in this definition of environment, a certain end game in the opposition between media was produced. In the wake of this, I would say, and Eve, I don't mean to be so generational, but even more recently, architects are now turning to what you might call adjacent mediums. This is a film by Michael Meredith. This is not an illustration of a building, it's not a drawing of a building, it's not an installation of a building, it's what I would describe as architecture beside itself, with all of the implications of that term. So, in order to try to understand what it would mean for architecture to become beside itself, this is an idiom in English. When you become beside yourself, you become slightly hysterical, you're not quite familiar to yourself. The rendering hysterical of architecture, if you will, is something that I would like to track through the coming together of the logic of affect and the logic of intellect. This is one of the ways that the post-medium condition has been described, in the coming together of the rigors of specificity and autonomy with a more relaxed environmental mode. This collision came together in a recent project called The Tender Room by Swiss artist Pipilotti Rist, a video work. This is a woman who is often described as a hysteric, with a hysterical interest in feeling, in feminism, in a kind of visual floridity, in the forms of excess of all kinds. And it was quite extraordinary to see all of that excessiveness installed in Peter Eisenman's Wexner Center, a building that was produced at the apex of architecture's turn towards disciplinary autonomy, conceptual rigor, and the notion of critical intellection that I was describing before. Given Eisenman's interest in the fragment, in discomfort, in all of the things that we know that Eisenman was interested in. It came as something of a surprise to think that tenderness or roominess could survive in such an environment. I would describe Eisenman's Wexner Center as completely hostile to those kinds of ideas. The Wexner has no rooms. If you look at its plan, it rejected the room as a banal spatial category rooted in bourgeois notions of inhabitation. You remember this famous destruction of the very category of the room in the Frank house. If you look at the bottom image, the Franks took their revenge on his hostilities by reuniting the banality of the marital bed. Clearly, the Wexner Center does not tolerate affect of any kind, considering feeling as merely that which gets in the way of intellection. Its hostility is neither gratuitous nor generic, but rather an essential element of its significance as an architectural project, which was the aggressive eradication from building of those sentiments and habits of use that condemned architecture to affirming falsely universalizing humanism and prescribing fixed patterns of social behavior. So to find this tender room surviving, even if somewhat precariously, in a world built on this commitment to conceptual structure and a world built on the exclusion of even a temperate interest in environmental comfort, was for me to witness a radical realignment in the relation of architecture to the other visual arts and a reconstitution of the ecology, if you will, of this set of relations. So the Tender Room was a highly complex work comprised of a large number of semi-discrete elements. 6 unframed screens suspended from the ceiling of the last of the Wexner's enfilade of galleries, showing rear projection, overlapping footage from various of Rist's videos, Pepperminta, Pour Your Body Out, and some others. Here you see them here. Mostly pink-colored film applied to the glass windows and the glass curtain wall, delimiting the gallery on 3 sides, the back, the side, and the ceiling. Square seating elements, you can see it here on the bottom, suggesting they were scaled to match the size of the windows in the curtain wall, to suggest that 2-dimensional pixels had burst out of their plane, if you will. Down around the corner, there was an antechamber containing a chandelier made of underwear, stiffened by God knows what, revealing the fulsome contours of the nether regions of now absent bodies, all bathed in an illegible projected image that leaked jagged scars of color onto the surrounding walls painted a deep fuchsia. And if you followed this like an airplane, if you looked up, you ended up in the restrooms where there were 2 small screens attached to the ceilings, showing the pulsing, gushing action of urine erupting forth into a vibrant world of color, something like projected piss paintings and upside-down Andy Warhol meets David Reed in the men's room. In its sustained engagement with sculptural, painterly, architectural, and filmic qualities, in its assemblage of spaces and mediums, in its flow from illicit representation to lyrical abstraction, the Tender Room is a work of tremendous richness, more radical and ambitious in its claims than Rist's previous installations. But above all, in its proximate difference from architecture, the Tender Room does interesting work in elucidating a definition that is useful to architecture of environment. The work's internal heterogeneity and comparative hypercomplexity derives principally from the fact that the Tender Room is not a room at all. If you compare this room to other of Rist's installations, this is Himalaya Sisters Room or Pour Your Body Out, that was at MoMA, which are both centralizing, clearly bounded with deliberately produced ambient consistency. This has nothing to do with them being inside. Rist produces the notion of the interior room even in cities, such as in this project here. The Tender Room was, by contrast, rather a series of spaces barely strung together by a pinkish haze and the accidents of physical contiguity. While you never actually exit one space before entering the next, the seemingly haphazard promenade emphasizes diversity rather than continuity of experience. For example, the contrast between the filtered museum light, which you see sort of pinkishly glowing around, that's in the main galleries, that makes everything look really good, and the bathroom's everyday fluorescence, which makes everything look crass and cheap, underscored the differential effects of illumination on both perception and value. The darkish walls of the undergarment room guarantee some, but not total, control of the image projected onto the underwear, and without adequate lighting, the underwear seemed just dirty rather than glowing. Most significantly, the theatrical gels that you see here on the big, massive windows only color rather than block exterior light, and hence render the visibility and intensity of the large-scale projections highly unstable. Their appearance shifts radically over the course of the day. This is a morning shot, this is a late afternoon shot. As the sun pours in, or if it does not pour in, and as currents of air produced both via air conditioning and the movements of bodies cause the screens to ripple. If you see the screen, if you look at the screens, they're hung in such a delicate fashion that if you get anywhere near them, which you do, the screens start to move around, and then the images also are rendered into a new kind of visibility, if you will. In other words, contrasting viewing conditions and ensuing forms of attention, looking up in a bathroom, squinting to make out an image misshapen by dirty underwear, or watching a literally moving picture, highlighted the interdependence of context and experience. These extreme environmental variations not only make the work precarious, but indicate that what is assumed to be the natural tendency of a video artist to want to control projection quality and to make equations of artistic control with power and imageability were exchanged for another currency. So although the Tender Room was not a room, it understood architecture as an artificial environment and engagement with building as a means of reshaping the technological and cultural mediation of experience. Riss did not merely install the Tender Room in a generic museum. She harnessed the Wexner and its hostilities to interrogate how the relationship between buildings and bodies, between male bodies and institutional power in particular, continued to predetermine our apperception of the world. Now, this notion of the installation as an environment is clearly something that has that links some of the most important visual and architectural practices of our time, forming families of concern that override differences in medium or format, and have ones that have generated by now their own massive economy. But if you just make a quick comparison between something like Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project and Riss's Tender Room, that similarity becomes quite clear, but other kinds of differences become more strident. So Eliasson engineers weather, if you will, at great cost in order to observe the effects on the social milieu, and works hard to make sure that everything looks, I would say better under its artificial sun. Everything glows with the value of this sun, whether it's a visitor at the Tate or a Louis Vuitton handbag. Riss shares certain interests, the effects of environment and the production of audiences and so forth, but rather than producing a kind of scientific nature, if you will, one that is consistent, that allows in a kind of laboratory setting the direct observation of these kinds of interactions, she understands building itself to already be an ecology in flux, one that shifts constantly over time, one that leaks between the interior and the exterior, one that captures passersby in its wake, and so forth. One of the strangest analogies that begins to come to mind when you see these projects together, and it's one that I have to say came to me suddenly and with a horrific shock. I did not want to see it there, but there it came anyway, was the fact that she had produced the original sun in a building, which is a rose window. You all know that the Gothic cathedral understood itself to be an environment and used the rose window as a way to produce magical light created without the sun. It's the kind of artificial environment, if you will. So rather than use the apparatus of science in the laboratory and so forth, Riss uses the cheap theatrics of theater, gels, and so forth to produce this long nave with a rose window at the end. For those of you who know your Christian iconography, you know that the rose window was associated with Mary. You begin to see, you go back and look at her videos and realize that there's a triptych of Eve eating her apples. There she is with her apples. You go around the corner. There's Eve. You go around the corner and you realize that the antechamber is really a sacristy, the room set aside, the offstage room in a church for taking on your clothes and putting off your clothes. The room, this is looking up in this crazy chandelier. The room also where the body and blood of Christ is ministered to, the ministries of liquid and so forth. So it becomes very clear, however, that she has taken on the notion of the building as an ecology and understood architecture's attachment to this ecology, to figuring this ecology in the shape of a male body. And she substitutes this male body for a female body, bleeding for no reason, constantly in flux, totally unpredictable, all of those kinds of transformations. Now, the point for me is not the gender change, although it's always useful to point out that we still think things in terms of gender. It's rather the use of gender and the use of this substitution of one body for another to try to change what it means to produce a subject in an environment, to try to understand what the flows back and forth between an environment and the things that it constitutes and produces generates. I think it's necessary for this conference that we remember that this is the Wexner Center. She is making a very particular reading of a type of architecture, the architecture of a certain kind of philosophy that we were talking about yesterday. This is Peter Eisenman's favorite drawing. At the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, every door had this image of the Vitruvian Man, which Peter to this day happily claims he chose because it was the only Vitruvian man with an erection. If you hadn't noticed. Look. So the virile man, the virile idea that gives shape to form is a completely different notion of this body squished, contingently produced up against its glass without a clear form, repeated and again, misshapen, bleeding, cosmetically transformed, turned into, I would say, the occupation of a state of tenderness. Now, if we take this notion, the interrupted image, the flowing environment, the environment and its object that are produced in relation one to the other, I'll conclude by showing you, just for fun, a few images of one last project and make a reach to Sanford and our shared fascination for the National Geographic with the hyenas and the lions. And I would say that architects tend to think of themselves as lions and to forget the hyenas. And the fact that the environmental drama of that film and then the production of the drama itself belongs neither to the lions nor to the hyenas, but in their interaction. And one of the most extraordinary things about that film was how at different times of day the lions ruled the roost, and then when they went off, kind of at night, the hyenas came, slightly illegal, kind of ugly, coming in and reshaped this landscape, took it over, occupied its body, if you will, in a way that I find very similar to Rist's occupation of Peter Eisenman. So this is Jason Payne's Raspberry Fields project, which you probably all know ad nauseum, but you probably don't know this particular view of it because he just finished it the day before yesterday, and he's updated the name, and it's now Rawhide. This is a very American reference. Rawhide was an old television show about cowboys, and rawhide are cows, but the bodies of cows cut into rugs. And there's an incredible remaking of the animal world to produce the rawhide, and to produce the rawhide not only as a physical thing, but also in its cultural life on television and so forth. So if you start to look at this house, you see in this huge part of it that Jason built, the kind of neck of the bull about to be lassoed by an absent cowboy. The bull's hairs are bristling. He's a kind of part bull, part object, if you will, about to be caught, hair standing literally on end, bleeding on the inside, curling in its state of agitation, if you will. And nothing could be farther than Picasso's notion of the bull, a graphic notion of the bull, linear, etc. And this kind of ecology, where the animal, the human, the cultural are in a very complex and I would say tender state of alignment. And this for me describes a contemporary model of the architectural environment. Thank you.